Welcome to the Taos Institute's Relational Research Network video series. In this series, we explore research from a relational perspective. We hear from people working with a relational research process and learn about related values, concepts, and practices. To start, here are some of our ideas. Research from a relational perspective embodies a philosophical and co-creative stance. It is thus not a method, per se, but rather a collaborative way of being. Engaging from this perspective entails an ethical responsiveness to a focus of inquiry. Recognizing that reality is created through language and social structures means it can also be recreated. Relational research is a process that is attentive to broader relations and interactions. The purpose is to expand possibilities and co-create transformative potentials. We hope you enjoy the series and invite you to join in the conversation. Duane Bidwell, A Conversation with Tahereh Barati. Relational Research as Shared Inquiry. Duane Bidwell is a professor of practical theology, spiritual care and counseling at Claremont School of Theology at Willamette University. He lives in California in the United States. Duane specializes in both comparative approaches to mental health and spirituality and in Buddhist Christian studies. His expertise includes complex religious bonds, suicide intervention, spiritual direction, solution-focused therapy, and narrative therapy.
Thank you, Duane, for accepting my invitation to come to this interview and conversation about relational research. Before we get into discussion around relational research, I would like you to briefly introduce yourself, situate yourself professionally, socially, geographically. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm grateful for the invitation and thank you for taking the time to interview. Professionally, I teach at Claremont School of Theology at Willamette University in Salem, Oregon, in the United States. And I am a professor of practical theology, spiritual care, and counseling, which means I focus on the practices of religious and spiritual communities. And I teach people who are training to be pastors and psychotherapists and chaplains from a spiritual perspective, and work primarily from kind of postmodernist constructionist therapies like narrative psychotherapy and solution-focused practice and those kinds of things. I am a member of the board of directors of the Taos Institute and a Taos associate, and have been involved with Taos for quite some time, actually, and have written some books and that kind of thing. I am currently in California with my wife and son in the midst of pandemic lockdown. And my own research tends to use grounded theory. And right now I'm working on a project that's using grounded theory in a relational way with children to explore how they understand hope, what hope is, how it shows up in their lives, how it gets nurtured. These are kids who have chronic illness who can't recover, right? It's life-threatening illness. So they have taught me a lot about life and about research. And I supervise PhD students who are using grounded theory and ethnography, critical ethnography, and phenomenological research, and sometimes thematic analysis, that kind of thing. So I work with lots of doctoral students through our program who are doing field work around the world to advance practices of care and trying to use relational research in ways that advance an ethic of care in the way that they interact with people and the way they frame what knowledge is for our disciplines. Yeah.
Talk to us about your definition of relational research. What does that mean to you?
Right. Well, relational research, I think what I tend, to emphasize is that relational research requires us to privilege the learning and interpretation that are happening in the process with everyone involved, right? It's not just the learning that the researcher is gaining or the interpretation that the researcher is doing, but the mutual generation of meaning through the research process as a sort of iterative thing. It's not just a one-time interaction, right? That you go back and forth with people. And that means the researcher has to attend to what gets generated by the questions they ask and the responses they make and the things they say, rather than simply being concerned with gathering data, right? That the questions we ask are actually creating possibilities or shutting down possibilities. So it puts a burden isn't the right word, a responsibility on the researcher to attend closely to what is being done, what is being constructed through the research conversation or the research process. In that way, I would say relational research really centers the process of transformation, of meaning making, and the creation of possibilities that accompanies the process for everyone, both participants and the researcher and the people who are reading or receiving the results of the research. Relational research then is holistic. It's grounded, it's embodied, it engages the full person of the researcher so that the researcher's responses, bodily, intellectual, spiritual, emotional, are as important as data as the input from participants. A university context where people are accustomed to positivist research, using words like participant and data becomes a necessary way of translating what we're doing for people who don't quite get the nuances or the values embedded in relational research.
Yeah, it feels like, new vocabularies, new language is coming with relational research between, researcher and participants, right? How do you do relational research? So share with us, some of the things that, some research that you've been doing,
I think this kind of shared inquiry is a meaning-making process, as I said before, and it is trying in which the person who is positioned in the researcher role or the role with more power necessarily in the relationship is to learn and understand the unique elements of the other person's language and sense it from the perspective of the other person, not from her own, right? So that we're always trying to be careful to misunderstand, by which I mean not to assume we know what the person means. So for me, that means taking a stance of not knowing and practicing a kind of epistemological humility by always asking what a person means or how they're using a term or what the nuances of that are for them, without assuming that I understand it, without taking the meaning I give to those words or those behaviors and making them ultimate or making them the norm against which that person is then measured or to which that person responds. Instead, I invite them to continue to make rich meaning of what's going on with them, what they're trying to communicate, where that comes from, and where it's leading them. So in addition to trying to be humble in what I know, I'm trying to ask generative or future-oriented questions about what becomes possible because of what they do know or what the meaning that they're making, right? So there are kind of three touchstones in my own work as clinician and as teacher and as researcher that have to do with identity, questions and ways of interacting that clarify a person's identity or help them claim the identities they prefer, agency, helping them find the places where they're empowered to take action, to own their own decisions with clinical students, to move them towards self-supervision, right? And possibility, by which I mean the places that desire is leading them and the ways in which the desire of being itself or the cosmos is coaxing them into some things, right? So the places where possibility or hope emerge for them. And that means I have to pay attention to my positionality in the relationship and the power I have to not unduly influence. I can't help but influence, but to make myself an apprentice to that person's experience, and to attempt to see with their eyes and hear with their ears and taste with their tongue and smell with their nose what it is that they're trying to communicate. So it invites me to enter into this kind of joint examination of experience where we are questioning and pondering and wondering and reflecting together about the topic to be addressed. And there are times when I'm positioned more as a social intimate, where we're both sharing out of our experience. And there are other times when my role is to be a curious, thoughtful, respectful visitor in that person's world, and to ask them to introduce me to the things in their house, right, in their landscape, and to interpret them for me rather than me interpreting them. So the values and the stance of relational research does get pretty infused in all of those activities for me.
Curious visitor. That's beautiful. It's very gently, and you're entering into people's world and having conversations with them. And also it feels like, you're letting them gently to walk into your life and having dialogue with each other. You're part of that process. It's not just about them.
Exactly. And that I have to own where my questions are coming from and practice transparency about that, right? To help them understand why I'm asking what I'm asking, or why I'm asking it the way I'm asking it, or even what becomes curious for me in the midst of the conversation. So some of the research I've done is working with children with chronic illness, and to help them understand why I want to know the things I want to know about their experience of their illness and hope, and position them as consultants who are helping other children first, and second, helping the adults in their life know how to better care for them in ways that make their life, help them flourish in their life with this disease, and that don't treat disease as a limitation, but as a resource.
Oh, wow. That's beautiful. I find it a little bit different in comparing with working with adults.
It is, yes, actually, because kids are honest. They don't often try to use their words or their experience to reach for ends or to manipulate people in the way. They just say what they're experiencing, at least in the context of the hospital and so forth. Kids have a lot of wisdom that is not couched in theoretical terms or in necessarily sophisticated language, but they tell you how things affect them. And they notice so much that adults don't notice. They're so often positioned as objects upon which adults act. But in that process, they are making rich meaning of what they see and experience, and telling themselves stories about what that means and about the people who are caring with them. And I am always amazed at the insights they have. In fact, I had one 14-year-old girl, when I said something like, wow, that's really profound. She said, yeah, we have a lot to teach you all if you would learn to listen to us. Which I thought was fairly prescient.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. We're into narrative more fully, I find. That's if I ask, tell me a story about a time you felt hopeful, I get a story. I don't get their thoughts about that. Right. Or the kind of adult qualifying of language. They just say what they think. My relationships with kids as a visitor into a dialysis unit who's not taking care of them, right? Who's there to come alongside and learn with them. They are much less focused on trying to be the thing that they think I want them to be, and instead helping me see what it's like to be in that medical system. And that's made me turn toward more relational medicine in terms of the relational medicine movement is usually about how can medical professionals make clients or patients more compliant with treatment or have a better customer experience through relationship. And that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about medicine that recognizes the humanity of the caregiver and the care receiver, and that puts their relationship at the center, not for instrumental purposes, but makes the quality of the relationship the thing that is center, and everything else results from that. Not trying to use the relationship to medical ends or fiscal ends, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think that makes relational research a little bit different than the way that we do research traditionally. I'm wondering, all these ideas that you have and the way that you're working with your supervisees or students and with other researchers. I'm wondering how have impacted you as a person.
I think primarily probably two things. One is that I have learned I have to own my position in the conversation much more clearly. I have to talk about the limits of my own knowledge, right? As a professor, you sometimes like to come in the classroom and say, this is the way things are, as if they should apply to all people. But as a relational researcher and relational practitioner, I have to be able to say from where I am and what I see, this is what I am interpreting. Here's how I learned what I'm telling you. How does that fit or not fit with your experience, right? So I have to be more clear about what is my interpretation of what others have said versus what others have said. It also makes me more aware, as I said earlier, of the power dynamic in certain relational situations because of the way institutions or social norms position us in relation to each other. I am more attuned to the advantages or the disadvantages, potential advantages, potential disadvantages of positioning myself or asking a certain question. When you are in a position of social authority, people will give you authority that you didn't ask for, whether you know it or not. And if you use that without being aware of what some of the advantages and disadvantages might be of acting in certain ways, you can distort the relationship or create meaning and set into movement futures you don't intend. And so being a relational practitioner asks me to be more aware of that context in which this relationship is unfolding. Some voices in some settings have more credibility, more power, more authority than others. So how do you use that in a way that reduces suffering and contributes to joy and equal relationship, as opposed to unwittingly carrying on structures and systems that put one person in a one down position and one person in a one up position. I don't feel like I'm being very clear about that, but as I talk about it, I think another way it has influenced me is I am, especially recently, really aware of how deeply grieved I am when I am interacting with people who don't want to be relational, with people who perceive relationships as instrumental or as necessary evils, maybe, right? But they're not interested in the co-construction of meaning. They're interested in promoting their agenda. And they they will be relational to the extent that it benefits them, but they're not interested in relationship to benefit the relationship. And that really deeply grieves me. And I am perhaps not as skilled as I wish I were in dealing in those kinds of situations. So it's not just joy and happiness that comes with the relational work, right? Yeah.
No, it's a lot of work to actually stay in a relationship, create a relationship, and sustain it over the time. It's beautiful what you said, that, you're becoming more aware of your own knowledge, the limits of your own knowledge, and also the position that you're taking in every setting. The level of awareness and also consciousness is a work in progress. It's something that we got to do it on a daily basis to become more aware of it. And it's not an easy things to do, not just so much immersed into our own interest, but somehow think about the others and the impact of what we do on others.
Yeah. Decolonizing ourselves and decolonializing ourselves takes work, and it's not ever done. Right? There are constantly powers that be that are seducing us into ways of being colonial or advancing colonization. And part of what the task of being relational is to strip that away and to say, what is here between us, not what do we both carry into this that already structures our relationship.
Yes.
A concrete example of that is in my own teaching in this year of pandemic. I've always been very attentive to including multiple voices in my reading lists in the classroom, to attending to classroom dynamics and power, to trying not to implicitly promote white academic norms as what everyone is striving for. But in the process of living with students, teaching them in the midst of pandemic, I started to see how much there are norms embedded in my syllabi and my pedagogy around things like every student should privilege their education over extended family. Every student has equal access to resources like time. The United States feels safe to all students. Those are unexamined assumptions that were behind my teaching that became clear in this pandemic era, that they're not tenable, that I'm promoting things in the way I teach that I consciously reject. So how do I begin to strip those away from teaching in order to be present to who students are, or who students are invited to be by their communities that might be different than an autonomous white male subject who has all the support they need to pursue graduate studies, right?
Yes. Yeah. And during the pandemic, we become more aware of, the inequality and lack of access to resources for so many people.
Exactly.
And that's a good invitation to somehow, strip things away and somehow reconnect and create new spaces for learning, right?
Yes, and to examine different types of learning. Who says I'm the one who gets to determine what learning is in my classroom? Students bring their own learning goals, and I need to learn to access and honor those rather than imposing mine.
Beautiful. So I'm wondering if you could a little bit talk about your hopes for the future of research as relational research is growing and is becoming more accessible or spreading out.
I hope that relational research, particularly among the students I supervise or coach, helps to cultivate an ethic of care that becomes a part of community structures and values. That the ways of being that relational research tries to advance in the research relationship become a part of larger communities and structures, so that local knowledges are valued, and that we perceive ourselves as co-learners or entering into shared inquiry together, rather than an educator as the sage on the stage, or even the guide on the side, as much as someone who is co-constructing a world with students and clients and people that we're trying to generate knowledge with, and that we understand the impacts of our research for the people we are engaging with, that we're trying to advance their flourishing through the way we relate in a micro and the macro effects of our research, that we are advocates for local knowledges and for emerging ways of being and knowing in ways that sometimes traditional research hasn't sought to be. So I guess partly you hear me saying relational research is or can be a type of activism, right? That it is about not doing for a community or doing to a community, but giving a community access to resources they can use to advance their own interests in this larger network that might devalue where they come from. Mm-hmm. What I do with students in particular as formation doesn't create distorted beings, but helps people actualize or build on all of who they are, rather than telling them, only bring these parts of yourself to the fore. Yes. Or in this context, always speak this way, right? And I experienced that with a student this week who was a Caribbean and started to say something and she went, oh my gosh, I almost said that using my dialect. Let me think of the right English way to say it. And I said, no, say it in dialect and then ask me what I understand about that, right? Why should you accommodate your language to me if the dialect is the best way of expressing what you're trying to say, or the natural way of expressing that?
Yeah. It's very important to be open to all these multiple voices, right? So you kind of allowing that to take place and not shutting it down. And I think that would be my hope for future as well. Somehow allowing all those voices to commingle and see what they can form, right?
Yes, exactly. And to recognize the suffering or the loss that comes by not using all of your voices or not honoring all voices.
Yeah, it's part of this new way of being, right? It's not all about me, it's about we and how we could create something.
Right. Yes. And how to sustain that we-ness outside the therapy room or outside the classroom where others might not buy into that way of being. But how do you if that's something you value, how do you honor that even with those who aren't willing to go there with you?
Thank you again for being part of this conversation. Any final remarks you have?
I'm grateful to the Relational Research Network for helping to create this conversation about relational research and what it is, how it functions, and what it can lead to. And to you as an interviewer, you are generous and present, and it feels like we've built something together here today. So I'm grateful. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you to Duane Bidwell and Tahereh Barati. More about Duane at www.taosinstitute.net/Duane-Bidwell. Please join in the conversation. What captured your attention in this video? How do you think these ideas reflect a relational orientation to research? Please leave a comment on this YouTube page or join our community at www.taosinstitute.net/relational-research-network. There you can find a lot more information and resources. We thank the Relational Research Network leadership team for the vision and dedication to making this video series come to life.